There is a particular kind of grief that makes no sound. It does not announce itself with tears or the collapse of the body. It simply settles, quiet and permanent, like snow over a garden that will never see spring again. Lady Emmeline Smith knew this grief intimately. She had been carrying it for 3 years, pressed flat against her ribs, hidden beneath the careful stillness of her smile. She was 24 years old on the morning she stood before a mirror in a borrowed cottage in rural Scotland, allowing a woman she barely knew to fasten the buttons of a cream wool gown up her spine. Not a wedding dress. She had been very specific about that. Just a dress. Something simple. Something that would not make her feel as though she were pretending to believe in something she had long since stopped believing in. The man waiting for her at the altar of the village chapel was kind. She needed the world to understand that. Edmund Fairley was a decent, patient, quietly devoted man who had found her broken on the edges of a life she no longer recognized and had offered her steadiness when she had nothing left but the effort of continuing. She was not marrying him for love. She was marrying him because love, she had been taught by experience, was a door that closed without warning and did not reopen. And a woman standing alone in the cold for long enough eventually stops waiting and simply walks away. She had not always been this still. 3 years ago, Emmeline Smith had been the kind of woman who laughed too loudly for drawing rooms and kept pressed wildflowers between the pages of her correspondence and wrote letters so full of feeling that her lady's maid used to blush reading them aloud. She had been, in the most genuine sense of the word, alive. And then, in the span of a single afternoon, her family had sat her down in the pale light of the Smith drawing room and told her a truth so clean, so precise, and so utterly devastating that it had rearranged the architecture of everything she understood about herself. Edmund Smith, her father, had not looked at her when he spoke. He had looked at the fireplace. He had said the words in the measured tone of a man delivering a verdict he found personally distasteful, but professionally necessary. The Duke of Crestwood, he told her, that had made his position known through private channels. A match with Emmeline was not something he was willing to pursue. Her lineage was respectable, yes. But respectable, her father said, with the particular cruelty of understatement, was not what a man of the Duke's standing required. She had not wept in the room. She had thanked her father, stood, smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, and walked upstairs. It was only later, sitting on the floor of her bedroom with her back against the cold plaster wall, that she allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of it. Not the rejection itself, but the specific, surgical humiliation of being quietly deemed insufficient by the one person in whose presence she had never once felt small. Now, 3 years and 400 miles later, she pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the cottage window and looked out at the grey Scottish morning. Somewhere behind her, the woman finished the final button and stepped back. Emmeline did not turn around immediately. She stood there a moment longer, watching a single sparrow land on the frost-covered sill, regard her briefly with its small, unreadable eye, and fly away. She exhaled, picked up her gloves, and went to be married. The chapel was small, the kind of place that felt genuinely holy rather than merely decorated to appear so. The stone walls were old enough to have witnessed a century of vows, and the winter light pushed through the narrow windows in thin, pale columns that settled across the flagstone floor like something searching. Emmeline walked down the aisle on no one's arm, as she had refused her father's offer. He was in London, and she had not wanted him to come, and the refusal had been the first truly decisive thing she had done in 3 years. That alone told her something about the shape her life had taken. Edmund waited at the altar with the particular expression of a man who understood he was receiving something precious that had not been offered freely, but carefully, deliberately, like a gift wrapped to conceal its cost. He was good. She reminded herself of that. He was good, and goodness was not nothing. Goodness was, in fact, considerably more than she had been led to expect from the world. The vicar began. Emmeline held Edmund's hands and looked at his face, and listened to the ancient words and told herself that this was peace. That peace was enough, and that the ache behind her sternum was merely habit, merely the body's stubborn refusal to accept what the mind had already accepted, and that it would pass as all things pass, if given sufficient time and silence. She almost believed it. She did not hear the chapel door open. The hinge was old, and the wind off the Scottish hills was loud, and the vicar's voice was measured and continuous. It was Edmund's eyes that told her. They shifted, just slightly, just once, toward the back of the chapel, and something moved across his expression that she had no name for, something between alarm and a particular resignation, as though he had always known, somewhere underneath his hoping, that this moment would arrive. Emmeline did not turn immediately. She held her breath for 1, 2, 3 counts, and then she turned. So he was standing just inside the doorway, still wearing his riding coat, his dark hair damp from the Highland rain, one gloved hand resting against the stone frame as though the building itself was what was holding him upright. James Whitmore, the Duke of Crestwood, looked exactly as she remembered him, and nothing like it at all. The composure she associated with him, that infuriating aristocratic stillness, was entirely gone. He looked like a man who had ridden through the night and arrived too late and knew it, and was standing inside that knowledge the way you stand inside a room after something has shattered on the floor, unable to move for fear of the glass. His eyes found her immediately. They always had. That had been one of the first things she noticed about him 3 years ago in a crowded Mayfair ballroom, and that he had a way of locating her in a room as though she were the fixed point and everything else was simply revolving around her. She turned back to the altar. Her hands, she realized distantly, were trembling. She pressed them flat against Edmund's and held on. The vicar, bless him, continued. It was Edmund who spoke. Quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it. He said her name, just her name, Emmeline, and the way he said it carried everything he would not ask aloud. She looked at him. His face was open and patient and entirely without malice, and she understood in that moment why she had chosen him. Not because she loved him as she once understood love, but because he had never once required her to be more than she was. She opened her mouth to tell him to continue, to tell the vicar to please go on. And then, from the back of the chapel, a voice said, "I cannot let this proceed." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The chapel was small, and the silence between the stones was absolute, and James Whitmore's voice, low and controlled and barely keeping its shape, filled every corner of it without effort. Edmund looked past her, steady and unhurried. The vicar stopped. Emmeline closed her eyes. "You will leave," she said. She was surprised by how level her voice was. She had always been better at composure than people gave her credit for. "Whatever you believe you are doing, you will stop. You do not have the right to be here." She heard his footsteps. Slow, deliberate, in the sound of someone choosing each step carefully because the alternative was running. He stopped at a distance that was respectful and insufficient, somewhere just behind her left shoulder. "Emmeline," he said, "do not." The word came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that she felt Edmund's hands tighten briefly around hers in response. She softened her voice with considerable effort. "Do not say my name as though you are owed something. You are not owed anything here." A long silence. Then, "I've been looking for you for 7 months." She laughed, and the sound was so foreign in that sacred space that it startled even her. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone encountering an absurdity too large to process in any other way. 7 months. He had spent 7 months looking for her. She had spent 3 years learning to stop expecting to be found. "Why?" she said. It was not a question. It was the complete sentence. Another silence. She heard him exhale. "Because I was told," he began, and then stopped, and she heard something shift in his voice, something that sounded involuntary. "Emmeline, I was told you had left London willingly. that you had formed an attachment to a man your family disapproved of, that you had, in their words, disgraced yourself, and that any contact from me would only deepen your humiliation. The chapel air was very cold. She became aware of it in a new way, as though the cold were a presence rather than an absence. "Who told you this?" she said. "Your brother, and your father's man of business. They came to me together. They were very composed, very credible." A pause. I did not question it as I should have, and I have not forgiven myself for that. Emmeline released Edmund's hands. She was not entirely conscious of doing it. She turned to face the Duke of Crestwood for the first time in 3 years, and the physical reality of him, the dark eyes that had not left her face since he walked through the door, the rigid set of his jaw that she now recognized as the architecture of a man trying not to come apart, hit her somewhere old and undefended. "My family," she said, measuring every word, "told me that you had communicated through private channels, that a match with me was not something you were willing to pursue, that my lineage was respectable but insufficient." Those were the exact words. Respectable but insufficient. She watched his face as she said it. No, she watched something happen there that she did not have a name for, something that moved beneath the surface of his expression like a stone dropped into still water. "I believed them," she continued, her voice quieter now, "because you were a duke, and I was a woman who had allowed herself to feel things she had no guarantee were returned, and when a person is already afraid, it does not take much to convince them that the thing they feared most is true." He said nothing for a long moment. The muscles in his throat moved. "That is not," he said at last, and his voice had lost its shape entirely. "Anything I said, or thought, or have ever, in any capacity, felt." She had known, somewhere under everything, that this was the shape of it. She had known the way you know things you cannot afford to know, or keeping the knowledge sealed away in some interior room you do not visit because the cost of visiting is too high. She had known, and she had survived by not knowing, and now he was standing in front of her in a Scottish chapel, saying the words aloud, and the seal was breaking, and she was not at all sure she was prepared for what was on the other side of it. Her composure, held together for 3 years by will alone, gave way. Not dramatically, not in the way of novels. It simply left, the way a held breath eventually must, and what replaced it was something very quiet and very young and utterly exhausted. "They sent me away," she said. The words came out small. "They told me the humiliation of remaining in London would destroy me, that I needed distance and time. They arranged the position in Edinburgh, the companion placement. They managed everything, and I was so hollowed out by what I believed you thought of me that I did not have the strength to resist them." She pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth, a gesture she had learned from 3 years of suppressing things in public. "I wrote to no one. I told myself that was dignity. I think now it was despair." James Whitmore crossed the distance between them. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could see with absolute clarity that his eyes were bright in the way eyes become when the body is preventing something it has reason to feel. "I went to your father's house in September," he said, "when I first understood something was wrong, when I realized I had received no correspondence from you after a certain point, and that the explanations I had been given did not hold together the way true things hold together." His voice was very low. "Your father told me you were well and settled and had asked for no contact. Your brother stood behind him and confirmed it. I had no legal standing to press further, and He stopped. "I should have pressed further. That is the sentence I've ended every day with for 7 months. I should have pressed further." Edmund Fairley, who had stood through all of this with a stillness that spoke of either great character or great pain, cleared his throat softly. Both of them turned to look at him. He was looking at Emmeline with the expression of a man reading a letter whose ending he had always suspected but had hoped to be wrong about. "Emmeline," Edmund said, gently, simply, the way he said everything. She looked at him. This good, patient, undeserving man who had offered her steadiness when she had nothing, who had never asked her to love him the way she had loved before, who had understood, without her ever saying it plainly, that he was not the first chapter of her life, but something quieter, something that arrived after the story had already broken her. "Edmund," she said, and her voice broke on his name in a way it had never broken saying it before. "I am so sorry." He nodded once, and she saw in his eyes that he was not destroyed by it, that somewhere in his generous and perceptive heart he had been ready for this, had perhaps been ready for it since the day she agreed to marry him with that careful, deliberate composure that was the opposite of joy. He loved her enough to release her without making her feel the weight of it. That was perhaps the finest thing anyone had ever done for her. He spoke briefly to the vicar. He picked up his coat from the front pew. He paused at her side for just a moment and said very quietly, "Be happy, if it is possible." And then he walked out of the chapel into the grey Scottish morning, and the door closed softly behind him, and Emmeline stood at the altar alone and felt the specific, terrible grace of being let go by someone who deserved better. The silence that followed was immense. James spoke first. "I do not expect anything from you." His voice was rough at the edges now, the composure entirely abandoned. "I have no right to stand here and expect anything at all. I came because I could not allow this to happen without you knowing the truth. Whatever you do with that truth belongs entirely to you." She turned to face him fully. She looked at him for a long time, this man she had spent 3 years trying to forget. This man her family had weaponized against her using nothing more than words and her own willingness to believe that she was not enough. She thought about the girl she had been, and the one who laughed too loudly and kept wildflowers in her correspondence, and believed with her whole unguarded heart that love was a door that stayed open. "Why did they do it?" she asked. "Not the Duke, her family." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father's financial position was more precarious than you knew. There was a creditor, a man named Voss, who had bought your father's debts and was willing to forgive them entirely in exchange for—" He paused. "In exchange for an introduction to your brother's business connections. Connections that would have been impossible to access had your father's elder daughter become a duchess and subjected the family to the level of scrutiny that would have followed." He said it plainly without softening it. She appreciated that. "You were not a scandal to be hidden, Emmeline. You were a complication to be removed." She absorbed this, the particular coldness of it, the specific, transactional nature of her own erasure. She had known her family was capable of self-preservation, but she had not known they were capable of performing it so thoroughly on her behalf, without her consent. She looked down at her hands. The gloves she had picked up in the cottage, the bare finger where, in another life, a ring might have been. "I do not know," she said slowly, "how to simply step back into the life I had before. I am not the same person who left it." "No," James said. "Neither am I." She looked up at him. "I spent 3 years," he said, "becoming a man who had lost something he did not know how to name because I had never been permitted to name it properly. I became quieter. I became less willing to be in rooms full of people. I became, I am told, considerably more difficult to be around." The edge of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, the memory of one. "I have no interest in pretending that none of it happened. I have no interest in returning to what we were before, because what we were before was unfinished and untested and conducted entirely in the presence of chaperones." He held her gaze with a directness that cost him something. "I am asking only for the chance to begin again, properly, without interference, at whatever pace you require, for however long you require it." Emmeline was silent for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the highland grass, and the thin winter light continued its patient work across the flagstones, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour in the unhurried way of places that have marked many hours and expect to mark many more. She thought about Edmund walking into the grey morning. She thought about her father looking at the fireplace. She thought about the floor of her bedroom in London, the cold plaster wall, the feeling of being reduced to exactly the size someone else had decided she was. She thought about the sparrow on the cottage windowsill, looking at her briefly with its small, unreadable eye, and flying away. She was 24 years old, and she was tired of being managed and redirected and measured against standards she had never agreed to. She was tired of silence as survival, so she was tired, most profoundly, of mistaking endurance for living. "You will give me time," she said. It was not a question. "As much as you need. You will not make decisions on my behalf. You will not speak for me to my family or to anyone else without my knowledge." Never again. She looked at him. His face was open in a way she had never seen it, stripped of every layer of ducal composure, simply a man standing in a cold chapel at the end of a very long journey, asking to be allowed to stay. She did not say yes. It was too early for yes. But she held out her hand, not in the formal way of ballrooms and introductions, but open, palm upward, the way you offer something fragile to someone you are beginning, carefully, to trust. He took it with both of his and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. The chapel settled around them. The light continued. Outside, Scotland went on being vast and cold and indifferent and beautiful, the way places are when they have witnessed enough human suffering to know that it is not, in the end, the final word. Emmeline Smith had gone to that chapel to be married and had walked out of it 3 hours later, with something considerably more uncertain and considerably more alive than a marriage. She had walked out with a beginning, and a beginning she was slowly remembering was not nothing. A beginning, if tended carefully and honestly, and without the interference of people who confused love with leverage, was everything. If this story moved you, stay with us. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being underestimated by the wrong people does not make you less. And if you want to see what Emmeline and James built from that beginning, in the months that followed, let us know in the comments below. Some stories are worth telling all the way to the end.